IDEA, providing 5 indicators of this disability to match the Federal Act's list of 5. So let's compare the language listed in the fact sheet with the language provided by our law through the scope of the 3 problematic areas of this definition. 1, measurement of time. 2, identification of emotions and behaviors. And finally, 3, measures of academic performance. As the maintained fact sheet asserts, many children, and I would even say most children, will demonstrate mannerisms and actions of emotional behavior disorders at various times. Thus, like IDEA does, one focus of determination in this measurement must be the time, on the aforementioned behaviors and emotions being chronic. Similar to IDEA, we see a use of the measurement of long periods of time, with no provision of an actual time frame. Though slight, the ambiguous language in both instances reveals the difficulty in using this term, this measurement, to effectively and authoritatively identify a student who is emotionally and behaviorally disturbed from a student who is just lapsing through one of these indicators. The fact sheet's use of the phrase over long periods of time implies that the behavior need not be consistent, rather that it may take place in chunked blocks of time, not necessarily linked together. Though the wording might appear to match the legislation, the measurement of time conflicts with IDEA's phrase, a long period of time, which implies that the student's disturbance, either emotional or behavioral, should be measured in a single block of time. Well, why am I focusing so intently on this phrase if they are so seemingly similar? Well, if we situate ourselves in the classroom, what is a long period of time? Or what are long periods of a time? Because I can tell you that some days when I'm in a classroom for 45 minutes with John oohing in the corner, bouncing up and down to be called on, refusing to do work and visibly and physically becoming angry when he is not called on, that period feels like a long period of time. When that behavior is then multiplied to multiple students, indicating and presenting behaviors that are similar, either in aggressive or immature or hyperactive, all of these periods and these weeks feel like long periods of time. But I can tell you that all of these students are not classified or categorized as students with an emotional disturbance. Beyond this measurement of time is the designation of which behaviors actually constitute an emotional disturbance and which are just results of adolescence. Clearly dissonant from the fact sheet's explanation of emotional disturbance and the definition provided in the IDEA is the fact sheet's precise use of naming emotions and behaviors that establish grounds for classification. The fact sheet provides explicit physical behaviors and emotions. This deliberate movement away from subjective terms like satisfactory or inappropriate paints a very clearly recognizable picture for someone, especially like me, who is not trained in psychological or cognitive behavioral approaches to students. While a provision of Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of '04 mandates students with a disability have highly qualified teachers in the classroom, the law's requirements focus entirely on special education teachers and not on general education or content teachers. The amended IDEA of 1997 highlighted the need to give all students meaningful access to the general curriculum and paved the way for No Child Left Behind's mission to help all students have access to the same standards in education. However, despite the move towards classrooms that integrate 40% special needs students and 60% general education students, a model labeled integrated co-teaching or ICT, in which present in the classroom are both a special education teacher and a content teacher, there has been little focus on equipping content teachers with the same high qualifications of working with these students that have very demanding individualized needs. Finally, and most notably, the fact sheet provides a quantifiable measurement of emotional and behavior disturbance in terms of adverse academic performance. It suggests that an emotional and behavior disturbance that results in students performing below grade level is the standard by which we should determine their special education category. Although this at least provides a more tangible measurement, it does not fully capture the spectrum of realities that teachers face on a daily basis. By this measurement, Jane, a 14-year-old in my 9th grade class, who is able to perform on level, who is able to achieve the grade level standards, does not meet the needs for an emotional disturbance. Jane, who occasionally shows a mood of apathy, who will occasionally put her head on the desk, and then sometimes leave the classroom with no clear indication of where that behavior came from, does not technically classify as a student with emotional disturbance because she can perform on level. Even though myself and colleagues who work with her and see her on an everyday basis believe that though she is performing on level, she is not performing at her individualized level. But still, individualized levels of academic performance do not necessarily match what the law is requiring. Thus, it becomes increasingly impossible to support the needs of students like Jane. Numerous authors and agencies have noted that the identification rates of students with emotional disturbance represent significant underestimates, meaning that students who should be protected under this law are simply not being identified and thus not being protected under what is guaranteed to them. In the 2013 edition of Psychology in the Schools, doctors of psychology Timothy Hanchin and Ryan Allen published a study entitled Identifying Students with Emotional Disturbance, School Psychologists' Practices and Perceptions. The study surveys school psychologists across the country, with one of its key questions being, how are school psychologists translating the federal guidelines into practice as they identify students with emotional disturbance? The study concludes that although the varied levels of definition comfort coupled with inconsistent practices can be the result of a number of variables, it, quote, seems plausible that variability in practice and the noted difficulties associated with determining ED eligibility can ultimately be traced back to federal definition that does very little to aid determination of eligibility or promote a conceptual understanding of ED as a construct, end quote. The study also compiles data that exposes the sharp underdiagnosis of students with ED, as well as the demographic makeup of ED students. The study cites that in January 2003, the Judge David L. Bazelon Center for Medical Health Law estimated that more than 80% of youth with mental and emotional disorders were not identified as ED. Although the approximate under-identification of students with ED is cause for concern, the demographic makeup of the students who have been found to be ED is more cause for concern, as it highlights the potential students we are missing. Hanchin and Allen contends that, quote, research shows that males are far more likely to be identified as ED than females, with some estimates suggesting that as many as 80% of all these students are male. Among racial and ethnic groups, national estimates suggest that African American students are over-identified. Students with lower socioeconomic status and from single-parent homes are also more likely to be categorized as ED than their middle to upper-class peers from traditional family units, end quote. If we put the research of emotional disturbance in perspective of our education system, we can conclude that a student attending a Title I school, a school concentrated with a population of over 40% low income, and statistically over 50% minority, it is more likely that these students have an emotional disturbance, even though they will not all be identified. In an ideal world, the solution would be to provide each of these students with some form of individualized education plan, so these students coming in with a higher likelihood of being ED can have their individualized needs met. However, we know that this is not realistic. We know that their funding is not there to provide each of these students with an IEP, and we know that the possibilities of a teacher being able to effectively identify classrooms that are already full to the brim is impossible. Researchers and practitioners focusing on the underreporting of emotional disturbances in the classroom have long advocated for a solution of early intervention. It is well documented that early interventions of identification and response can alter patterns of behavior that might eventually develop into a long-term emotional or behavior problem. Contemporary educational initiatives sweeping the nation, including Common Core State Standards and the Danielson Framework of Teacher Evaluation, reinforce these early intervention approaches. Even the trending focus in higher education studies is that of early education. However, such educational developments only force me to suppress the rising inside of me. Because, of course, if we can meet these students before they come into the classroom and provide them with the tools they need before they come into our classrooms, that would be ideal. However, when you're in front of a 9th grader who already is coming in with this emotional behavior disorder, the early intervention phase has passed. So what we need to do is focus on the students that we have in front of us. The interventions to support these students, so many of whom are dealing with some degree of emotional disturbance, must be pervasive, and it must be now. Of course, the interventions to support these students must be now. Though this knowledge might seem basic, it must impact our daily interventions with this particular student population. It must influence how we perceive and manage student behaviors, both inside and outside of the classroom. My affinity for English literature was born out of an immense obsession to understand language with the intention to take some type of control over it. In my career now, I hope when I try to instill in my students the same sense of passion and empowerment that language can provide us. Derrida's affirmation implies that we exist in, move in, and are held captive by a system operated by language. It is time we move towards owning our language and the language we disseminate throughout education. We are here to advocate for our children, to discuss how we can help them make good choices, the best choices given their individual circumstances. Before we can grandly delineate the good choices our youth can make, we must make the choice to take control of the language that impacts the students we encounter on a daily basis. If we can conclude that our students in high-risk, high-need schools are coming in with higher likelihood of exhibiting some degree of emotional behavior disturbance, we must be able to meet them with clarity on what constitutes this disorder so that we can implement the most appropriate interventions. That clarity stems from a usable, authoritative source of our classification language. We know that the root of the issue is encompassing this disorder are that the definition presents pervasive confusion in recognizing emotional disturbance in terms of measurement of time of the problem behaviors, standardization of what problem emotions and behaviors are, and how we individualize adversarial impacts of academic performance. So this is where we must collaborate to elevate this definition of emotional disturbance from just words to a language we can actually own and use. Thank you very much.